Have you ever heard something in your walls and convinced yourself it was nothing? But what if it wasn't? What if the sounds weren't just noises, but a voice, a whisper, a cry for help? Would you dare to listen? Would you dare to find out what's hiding behind the wall? What would you do if one night you heard desperate scratching behind your walls and found something no one was supposed to see? Ethan Walker had never believed in ghosts. He didn't believe in fate either. If he had, he would have spent the last 3 years cursing whatever cruel force had torn his family away from him. But ghosts? Spirits? The supernatural? No. Those were just stories people told themselves to explain the unexplainable. Before we continue, tell us where in the world. Are you watching Ing from If You're Enjoying These Stories, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing. Which is why, when his dog, Max, started barking like a rabid beast at the living room wall, Ethan's first reaction was to sigh in frustration. "Max, knock it off," he muttered, rubbing his temples. Max didn't stop. The German Shepherd's claws scraped at the drywall, his powerful body slamming into it with a force that made the old house tremble. His growls were deep, primal, filled with a desperation Ethan had never heard before. That's when he felt it. A chill ran down his spine, sharp and electric, like a blade of ice pressed against his skin. His pulse quickened. His instincts, long honed from years as a U.S. Marshal, told him something was wrong. "Max," he called again, his voice firmer now. The dog didn't even glance at him. His ears were pinned back, his tail stiff as a board. Every fiber of his being was locked on that one spot in the wall. And then Ethan heard it, a sound so faint, so barely there, that for a second he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. He held his breath, straining to listen. A muffled whimper. His blood turned to ice. The sound was soft, barely more than a whisper against the silence of the house. But it was unmistakable. Someone was crying behind the wall. Ethan bolted upright, from the couch, his heart hammering against his ribs. His first thought, "What the hell is going on?" His second thought, "No, this is impossible." The house had been abandoned when he bought it. A small, worn-down property on the outskirts of town. No neighbors for miles. Just him, Max, and the memories he didn't want to face. But now, as he took slow, measured steps toward the wall, every muscle in his body coiled with tension. He crouched down beside Max, pressing his palm against the cold surface. "Hello," he said, his voice rough from disuse. Silence. Then, another whimper. Louder this time. Closer. His throat tightened. Whoever was in there, they were alive. Ethan scrambled to his feet, adrenaline surging through his veins. He grabbed the flashlight off the coffee table and flicked it on, running the beam over the wall. There were no seams, no hidden doors, no signs that anyone had been here before him. Just old, peeling wallpaper and a house filled with too many ghosts of its own. His hands clenched into fists. He knew what he had to do. "Max, move!" The dog obeyed instantly, stepping back, but keeping his eyes locked on the wall like he was guarding it. Ethan strode across the room, yanked open the hall closet, and grabbed the crowbar from the bottom shelf. Then he hesitated. Whoever was in there, were they in trouble? Were they hiding? Or had someone put them there? His jaw clenched. No time for second-guessing. With a deep breath, he braced himself and swung the crowbar against the wall. The first strike sent a crack rippling through the drywall. Dust exploded into the air. Ethan coughed, but didn't stop. He swung again and again. By the fourth strike, he punched through. A jagged hole appeared, revealing a dark, narrow space behind it. The air inside was thick, stale, suffocating. He shined his flashlight inside, and his heart nearly stopped. A child, a little girl, no older than 7 or 8, sat huddled in the cramped space, her knees pulled tight to her chest. Her long blonde hair was tangled, matted with dirt. Her cheeks were streaked with grime, her lips cracked, and her eyes terrified. She flinched at the light, her entire body shrinking away like a wounded animal. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. What the hell was she doing in there? He knelt, his movements slow, deliberate. "Hey." His voice came out softer than he expected. "It's okay. You're safe now." The girl didn't answer. She just stared at him, frozen. Max let out a low, cautious whine and took a step closer. For a long, agonizing second, the girl didn't move. Then, almost imperceptibly, her gaze shifted to Max. Ethan saw it. The faintest flicker of recognition in her eyes, like something in her brain finally clicked. Max took another step. The girl didn't pull away. Instead, with hands trembling like brittle leaves, she reached out and touched his fur. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His grip on the crowbar loosened. Whatever nightmare this girl had just come from, it wasn't over yet. But one thing was clear. She needed him. And God help whoever had done this to her, because Ethan wasn't about to let them take her back. Ethan's breath was slow, controlled, but his heart pounded like a war drum. The wall had been hollow. That much was clear. But he hadn't expected this. The air inside was thick, damp, and wrong. The kind of wrong that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. His flashlight's beam cut through the dust swirling in the tight space. And then he saw her. A child. A small, trembling girl curled up against the wooden beams, knees pulled to her chest, arms wrapped around herself in a desperate, protective cocoon. She didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even breathe loudly. Ethan's stomach clenched. She had been in there for days, maybe longer. Her blonde hair was tangled, matted with dirt, her skin pale and sickly in the dim light. Her face, what little he could see beneath the mess of grime and shadows, was drawn tight with fear. But her eyes, hollow, haunted, terrified. Ethan had seen that look before. On victims who had suffered too much, on people who had lost everything. And now, on her, his grip on the crowbar tightened, his knuckles white. Who did this to you? Beside him, Max let out a soft whimper, his ears flattening. The dog felt it too, the wrongness in the air, the unspoken horror of what had been done. Max took a cautious step forward, sniffing the opening. His tail flicked low, slow, a silent, gentle plea. The girl flinched but didn't pull away. Ethan swallowed, forcing his voice to come out steady. "Hey, sweetheart," he said softly. "You're safe now." No response. She just stared, wide-eyed, bracing. She was waiting, not for help, not for comfort, for pain. Ethan clenched his jaw. Jesus. Slowly, he set the crowbar down. No sudden movements, no sharp noises. He would not scare her more than she already was. "Can you come out?" he asked gently. A long, heavy silence. Then, she shook her head. Ethan's breath hitched. She didn't want to leave. Not because she was safe inside that tiny, suffocating space. But because whatever was outside had been worse. His hands curled into fists at his sides. What kind of monster does this to a kid? He crouched lower, eyeing the tiny hole. She could barely fit in there. The walls pressed against her fragile frame like a coffin, the air so thick it made Ethan's own lungs feel tight. How long had she been alone in there? No food, no water, just waiting. Ethan's throat tightened. "All right," he murmured. "Then I'm coming in." The girl stiffened. Her fingers twitched against her arms, clenching tighter. But she didn't speak, didn't cry, didn't even beg him not to hurt her, because someone else already had. The thought sent molten rage curling through Ethan's veins, but he forced it down. Later. The anger could come later. Right now, she needed gentleness. He reached for his pocket knife and carefully began cutting away the rest of the drywall, widening the hole. He took his time, making sure not to startle her, making sure she saw every move he made. When the last piece of wood splintered free, he exhaled and reached a hand toward her. "Okay," he murmured. "Let's get you out of there." She didn't move, but Max did. The dog inched closer, ears low, tail barely wagging. His warm nose brushed against her filthy knee. And this time, her fingers twitched. A tiny, barely there motion, but Ethan saw it. Max sat, completely still. No sudden movements, no noise, just waiting. And then, hesitantly, trembling, she reached out. Her small hand shook violently, fingers uncertain as they tangled into Max's fur. Ethan felt something in his chest crack. Max stayed perfectly still, letting her hold on, letting her ground herself. For the first time, her breathing changed. It was still fast, still uneven. But it was no longer silent. She was coming back to life. Ethan exhaled. "That's Max," he said gently. "He's a good boy." No response, but she didn't pull away. Ethan stayed crouched, keeping his voice steady. "Can you tell me your name?" Flinch. Not a word, just pure, raw fear. Ethan clenched his jaw. "Jesus Christ." He softened his tone even more. "Sweetheart, I need to help you. But I can't do that if I don't know your name." For a long moment, she didn't blink, didn't breathe. Then, barely above a whisper, so faint that Ethan almost thought he imagined it. "Sophie." Ethan's chest tightened. "Sophie." It wasn't much, but it was a start. "Okay, Sophie." He nodded, keeping his tone gentle. "I'm Ethan. It's nice to meet you." She stared at him, still deciding, still wondering if he was just like them. He pointed toward the open space beside them. "Do you think you can come out now?" Sophie hesitated. Her tiny fingers clung to Max like a lifeline. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she nodded. Ethan extended a hand. She didn't take it. Instead, she crawled out on her own, dragging herself through the hole with slow, deliberate movements. The moment she was free, her legs gave out. Ethan lunged forward, catching her before she hit the ground. Jesus, she was so light, like a bird that hadn't eaten in weeks. Sophie stiffened at his touch, but she didn't pull away. Max nudged her hand, warm and solid. And for the first time, the very first time since Ethan had found her, Sophie relaxed. Not much, but enough. Just enough for Ethan to know she wasn't about to bolt. Still holding her gently, he glanced at the space inside the wall, his stomach twisting in horror. Who the hell put her in there? And more importantly, why? Ethan didn't know yet. But one thing was certain. Whoever had done this, they were going to pay. The dim light of the living room cast long shadows against the walls. The room was eerily silent, except for the faint sound of Sophie's uneven breathing. She sat curled up on the couch, her small hands wrapped around the warm mug Ethan had given her, though she had yet to take a sip. The oversized sweatshirt swallowed her tiny frame, making her seem even smaller, more fragile. Max lay beside her, his large head resting on her lap. He could sense it too, the weight pressing down on the room, the unspoken fear Sophie carried like a ghost clinging to her skin. Ethan sat across from her, watching, not in a way that was imposing, but with the careful patience of a man who knew the importance of silence. He had seen this kind of fear before, the kind that turned people into ghosts of themselves long before they were ever truly gone. He exhaled slowly. "Sophie," he began, his voice gentle but firm, "can you tell me how long you were in there?" Sophie didn't answer right away. She stared into the swirling steam rising from her cocoa, as if it could somehow give her the words she didn't know how to say. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she shook her head. "You don't know?" Ethan pressed softly. Another small shake. His stomach twisted. That wasn't a good sign. When people lost track of time like that, it meant they had been left in the dark, literally or figuratively, for far too long. He clenched his jaw but kept his voice steady. "Do you remember how you got there?" Sophie's fingers tightened around the mug, her knuckles turning white. Ethan held his breath, waiting. And then, barely above a whisper, so faint he almost thought he imagined it, she said, "They put me there." Ethan's pulse spiked. Not, "I hid in there." Not, "I got stuck." They put me there. A slow, burning rage coiled in his chest. Someone had done this to her. Someone had deliberately locked this child away like she was nothing, like she was disposable. His hands curled into fists against his thighs. "Who put you there, sweetheart?" he asked, forcing his voice to stay calm. Sophie's whole body stiffened. She shrank into herself, shoulders hunching like she was trying to disappear into the fabric of the sweatshirt. Max whined softly and nudged her with his nose. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then, her lips parted. "The bad men." Ethan felt ice crawl down his spine. A cold wave of fury, sharper than any blade, surged through him. He had dealt with criminals before, seen the worst of humanity in the underbelly of society. But this was different. This was calculated. This was targeted. He forced himself to breathe, to keep his emotions in check. Did these bad men have names? Sophie shook her head quickly. No names. Her breathing was quicker now, shallower. They just came. Ethan's jaw tightened. Came from where? Where did they come from? He asked carefully. Sophie's gaze darted to the window, a terrified reflex. Ethan followed her line of sight, his gut clenching. Was she afraid they'd come back? She licked her dry lips. They took me from our house. Our house. Ethan's breath hitched. Her house. Her mother. If Sophie had a mother, where was she now? He leaned in slightly, keeping his voice low. Where's your mom now, Sophie? Silence. A long, painful silence. Then, Sophie's face crumbled. Her small hands clenched around the blanket as her tiny body started shaking. Her lips trembled, but no words came. And Ethan knew before she even said it. Tears spilled over her lashes. her tiny shoulders trembling with the weight of something far too big for her to carry. And then she whispered the words that shattered what little control Ethan had left. They hurt her. The breath left Ethan's lungs. His fingers twitched, his jaw clenching so hard he thought his teeth might crack. The rage that erupted inside him was instant. They hurt her, and now Sophie was here, alone, locked in a goddamn wall, left to starve or suffocate. He had no idea who these men were, but one thing was clear. They hadn't just taken her mother. They had been looking for Sophie, too. His mind spun. This wasn't random. Whoever had done this, they hadn't just hurt her mother and left. They had tried to erase Sophie, too, which meant they'd come back. Ethan exhaled through his nose, forcing his voice steady. "Did they see you escape?" Sophie shook her head quickly, her wet cheeks shining in the dim light. I ran. I don't think they saw. I just hid." And then she trailed off, looking at the wall she had been trapped behind. Ethan swallowed hard. He wasn't sure if the tightness in his chest was rage or something else. "You were smart," he told her. "You did good, kid." Sophie sniffled. "But what if they come back?" Ethan's grip on his knees tightened. "They won't," he said, his voice like iron. "I won't let them." Sophie blinked up at him, her small face uncertain. And Ethan meant it. Whoever these men were, whatever the hell they wanted, they weren't taking her, not while he was still breathing. Ethan's truck pulled up a block away from his house, the headlights off. His grip tightened around the steering wheel as he scanned the darkened street. Something wasn't right. He could feel it in his gut. A familiar, gut-wrenching instinct that had kept him alive in his years as an investigator. Beside him, Sophie sat rigid in the passenger seat, Max curled up protectively beside her. The dog's ears twitched, his nose sniffing the air. He felt it too. The house loomed in the distance, silent, still. But Ethan wasn't fooled. The front door was slightly ajar. A light flickered in one of the windows. Someone had been here, or worse, they still were. A slow, suffocating dread settled in his chest. "Stay here," he murmured to Sophie. She didn't argue, but her small fingers clenched into Max's fur. Ethan slipped out of the truck, pulling his gun from its holster. His every step was controlled, deliberate, silent. Years of training had taught him how to move without a sound. He crept toward the house, his pulse steady, but his mind racing. He had locked the door before they left. He was sure of it, which meant whoever had entered had either picked the lock or had a key. A fresh wave of anger burned through him. His fingers flexed around the gun as he pressed against the house's outer wall, listening. Then, movement. Inside. Ethan's breath slowed. He peeked through the shattered window. The living room was trashed. Furniture overturned, drawers yanked out, their contents scattered across the floor. His coffee table was snapped in half. Papers, books, even his few framed photographs were shattered, their glass glinting under the dim ceiling light. But what sent ice through his veins was what was smeared across the wall. Dark, jagged letters, written in something thick, something red. "Trust no one." Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears. It wasn't paint, it was blood. He clenched his jaw. This wasn't just a break-in. This was a message. Then, another sound. Footsteps. They were still inside. Ethan flattened himself against the wall, forcing his breath to steady. He had to be smart. He wasn't up against common burglars. These were professionals. And that meant they were waiting for him. A shadow flickered past the hallway. Ethan moved, silent, swift, deadly. His boots barely made a sound as he slipped inside. The air smelled of dust and something metallic, something old and rotting. His muscles coiled as he stepped past the overturned couch, his gun raised. The hallway stretched ahead, dark and ominous. Then, a whisper, so faint he almost missed it, rustling. A breath. The closet door. Someone was inside. Ethan's grip on his gun tightened. He could feel the presence behind the thin wooden door, could hear the barely contained breath of someone trying not to make a sound. Every second stretched like an eternity. Then, he moved. In one swift motion, Ethan yanked the closet door open and slammed his forearm against the figure inside, pinning them to the wall. A grunt, a struggle, the glint of a knife. Ethan knocked it away with lightning-fast reflexes and shoved the barrel of his gun against the intruder's ribs. A man, dressed in all black, face covered. But Ethan could see his eyes, cold, calculating, trained. "Who sent you?" Ethan growled. The man smirked. Then he bit down. Ethan's instincts screamed at him. The man convulsed. A muffled gurgle escaped his throat, his body jerking violently, foam spilling from his lips. A cyanide pill. Ethan cursed, shoving him away as the man's body sagged lifelessly to the floor. They'd rather die than be caught. His heart pounded. He had minutes, maybe seconds. If one of them was here, more would come. He had to get Sophie out. Now, Ethan stormed back toward the front door. But then he heard it. A car engine. Another. And another. He froze. Headlights flashed through the shattered windows. The faint crunch of tires on gravel. His gut twisted. They weren't just coming. They were already here. Ethan ran. He bolted out the door, across the yard, his eyes locking onto the truck where Sophie and Max were still waiting. "Sophie! Get down!" Max barked. Sophie gasped. Then, the first shot rang out. A bullet slammed into the truck's windshield, cracking it like a spiderweb. Sniper. Ethan dived behind the truck, shielding Sophie as another shot ripped through the night, this time hitting the side mirror. Max growled, pressing against Sophie. She was shaking, wide-eyed. No, he wouldn't let them take her. Ethan's mind raced. He needed a way out. Then he saw it. The woods. Thick, dark, twisting trails only he knew. A sniper wouldn't be able to get a clear shot in there. "Sophie," he whispered urgently. "We have to run. Do you understand me?" She nodded, gripping Max's fur. "On 3. Stay low." She swallowed hard. "Okay." Ethan counted under his breath. 1. Another shot rang out, hitting the hood of the truck. 2. The men were getting out of their vehicles now, moving fast, armed. 3. Ethan grabbed Sophie's hand and ran. Ethan's truck pulled up a block away from his house, the headlights off. His grip tightened around the steering wheel as he scanned the darkened street. Something wasn't right. He could feel it in his gut, a familiar, gut-wrenching instinct that had kept him alive in his years as an investigator. Beside him, Sophie sat rigid in the passenger seat. Max curled up protectively beside her. The dog's ears twitched, his nose sniffing the air. He felt it too. The house loomed in the distance, silent, still. But Ethan wasn't fooled. The front door was slightly ajar. A light flickered in one of the windows. Someone had been here, or worse, they still were. A slow, suffocating dread settled in his chest. "Stay here," he murmured to Sophie. She didn't argue, but her small fingers clenched into Max's fur. Ethan slipped out of the truck, pulling his gun from its holster. His every step was controlled, deliberate, silent. Years of training had taught him how to move without a sound. He crept toward the house, his pulse steady, but his mind racing. He had locked the door before they left. He was sure of it, which meant whoever had entered had either picked the lock or had a key. A fresh wave of anger burned through him. His fingers flexed around the gun as he pressed against the house's outer wall, listening. Then, movement. Inside. Ethan's breath slowed. He peeked through the shattered window. The living room was trashed, furniture overturned, drawers yanked out, their contents scattered across the floor. His coffee table was snapped in half. Papers, books, even his few framed photographs were shattered, their glass glinting under the dim ceiling light. But what sent ice through his veins was what was smeared across the wall. Dark, jagged letters, written in something thick, something red. "Trust no one." Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears. It wasn't paint, it was blood. He clenched his jaw. This wasn't just a break-in. This was a message. Then, another sound. Footsteps. They were still inside. Ethan flattened himself against the wall, forcing his breath to steady. He had to be smart. He wasn't up against common burglars. These were professionals. And that meant they were waiting for him. A shadow flickered past the hallway. Ethan moved, silent, swift, deadly. His boots barely made a sound as he slipped inside. The air smelled of dust and something metallic, something old and rotting. His muscles coiled as he stepped past the overturned couch, his gun raised. The hallway stretched ahead, dark and ominous. Then, a whisper, so faint he almost missed it. Rustling. A breath. The closet door. Someone was inside. Ethan's grip on his gun tightened. He could feel the presence behind the thin wooden door, could hear the barely contained breath of someone trying not to make a sound. Every second stretched like an eternity. Then, he moved. In one swift motion, Ethan yanked the closet door open and slammed his forearm against the figure inside, pinning them to the wall. A grunt, a struggle. The glint of a knife. Ethan knocked it away with lightning-fast reflexes and shoved the barrel of his gun against the intruder's ribs. A man, dressed in all black, face covered. But Ethan could see his eyes, cold, calculating, trained. "Who sent you?" Ethan growled. The man smirked. Then he bit down. Ethan's instincts screamed at him. The man convulsed. A muffled gurgle escaped his throat, his body jerking violently, foam spilling from his lips. A cyanide pill. Ethan cursed, shoving him away as the man's body sagged lifelessly to the floor. They'd rather die than be caught. His heart pounded. He had minutes, maybe seconds. If one of them was here, more would come. He had to get Sophie out. Now! Ethan stormed back toward the front door, but then he heard it. A car engine. Another. And another. He froze. Headlights flashed through the shattered windows. The faint crunch of tires on gravel. His gut twisted. They weren't just coming. They were already here. Ethan ran. He bolted out the door across the yard, his eyes locking onto the truck where Sophie and Max were still waiting. "Sophie, get down!" Max barked. Sophie gasped. Then, the first shot rang out. A bullet slammed into the truck's windshield, cracking it like a spider web. "Sniper!" Ethan dived behind the truck, shielding Sophie as another shot ripped through the night, this time hitting the side mirror. Max growled, pressing against Sophie. She was shaking, wide-eyed. No, he wouldn't let them take her. Ethan's mind raced. He needed a way out. Then he saw it. The woods. Thick. Dark. Twisting trails only he knew. A sniper wouldn't be able to get a clear shot in there. "Sophie," he whispered urgently, "we have to run. Do you understand me?" She nodded, gripping. Max's fur. "On 3. Stay low." She swallowed hard. "Okay." Ethan counted under his breath. 1. Another shot rang out, hitting the hood of the truck. 2. The men were getting out of their vehicles now, moving fast, armed. 3. Ethan grabbed Sophie's hand and ran. They disappeared into the trees just as bullets tore through the air behind them. Their world had just gotten smaller. And the hunt? It had only just begun. Ethan drove like the devil himself was on their heels, because for all he knew, he was. Thus, old Chevy roared down the empty highway, its tires humming against the cracked asphalt. A nearly full moon hung in the sky, casting eerie silver streaks over the endless stretch of road ahead. Sophie sat in the passenger seat, small and silent, wrapped in the oversized hoodie he had given her. She hadn't spoken since they left the house. Max sat between them, his ears perked, eyes locked on the rear window. Watching. Waiting. Ethan's grip tightened on the wheel. His mind raced. Whoever had ransacked his house hadn't been looking for valuables. They had been looking for Sophie. And that meant they weren't far behind. The thought sent a sharp wave of anger burning through his chest. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 2:17 a.m. They still had a long way to go before they reached Victor's safe house, but the highway was too open, too exposed. If anyone was tailing them, he'd see their headlights in an instant. But what if they weren't following by car? Ethan's gut twisted. These people weren't just thugs. They were professionals. They had already gotten into his house without setting off a single alarm. What if they had another way of tracking them? A cold knot settled in his stomach. "Max," he muttered, keeping his eyes on the road. "Anything?" The dog didn't growl, but his ears twitched. His body remained tense. Not a good sign. Ethan checked the rearview mirror. Nothing but empty road behind them. No headlights, no movement. Just endless black stretching into the horizon. But something felt wrong. Sophie shifted beside him, her small hands curled into the fabric of his hoodie. Then, softly, like she was afraid to even say it out loud, "They're coming." Ethan's chest tightened. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror again, pulse hammering. "How do you know?" Sophie swallowed. "I just do." That was all she said. And somehow, that was worse than any concrete proof he could have asked for. Ethan's grip on the wheel tightened. If she was right, he needed to act fast. He couldn't afford to take the highway all the way to Victor's. Too predictable, too easy to trap. He spotted an exit sign ahead, old and rusted, barely legible. Gravel Creek. Road, 2 miles. A back road, remote. Hard to track. Harder to escape if things went south. It was a risk, but he was running out of options. Ethan slammed his foot on the gas. They needed to disappear. Now, the second Ethan took the exit, his gut told him he had made the right choice. The 2-lane back road was dark, winding, surrounded by dense forest on both sides. No streetlights, no cameras, just isolation. If they weren't being followed yet, this would give them a fighting chance. For the first time in an hour, Ethan felt like he could breathe. Then, headlights. A pair of blinding white beams suddenly cut through the darkness behind them. Ethan's heart stopped. Then the vehicle accelerated. "Sophie," he said, voice sharp. "Get down!" She didn't hesitate. She slid lower into her seat, pulling the hood up over her head. Max pressed close to her, his body a solid, protective shield. Ethan's jaw clenched. He flicked the rearview mirror up to block the glare, but it didn't matter. Whoever was behind them wasn't just following. They were hunting, and they had found their target. The SUV gained speed, its massive frame barreling forward like a wrecking ball. Ethan knew exactly what they were trying to do. They weren't here to run him off the road. They were here to box him in, to cut off every possible escape route. Ethan's pulse hammered. "Not tonight, assholes." His fingers clenched around the steering wheel. He knew this road well, had driven it 100 times before. He also knew that 2 miles ahead, the pavement ended. Beyond that, gravel, dirt, and a sharp, goddamn drop-off. Perfect, Ethan took a deep breath. Then he slammed on the brakes. The tires squealed, burning rubber against asphalt. The SUV behind him was going too fast. They weren't ready for it. They veered hard to the side to avoid collision. And that's when Ethan yanked the wheel left and floored it. The truck spun, skidded, then shot forward down a barely visible dirt path. One only locals would know existed. A path full of sharp turns, uneven terrain, and just enough obstacles to make pursuit a nightmare. Ethan could already feel the wheels struggling against the loose dirt. If he lost control, they'd be dead. He checked the mirror. The SUV had recovered, and they were still coming. "Shit," Ethan growled under his breath. The truck bounced violently over a pothole. Max let out a sharp bark. Sophie gasped, gripping the seat. "Hold on!" Ethan yelled. Ahead, the road narrowed sharply. On one side, thick trees. On the other, a steep ravine. If he took this turn too fast, they'd go over. But if he slowed down, they were dead. The SUV was gaining. And then, an idea hit him. A long shot. Insane. Probably suicidal. But it was all he had. Ethan yanked the emergency brake. The truck jerked violently to the right, but just for a second. Then he released it and gunned the gas. The truck spun out, but controlled. Dust exploded into the air as the vehicle whipped around the bend like a goddamn stunt driver. The SUV didn't make it. The bigger vehicle tried to follow, but it was too fast, too heavy, too wide. Its tires clipped the edge of the ravine. Ethan barely had time to watch as the whole SUV flipped, tumbled, then plunged over the side. It disappeared into the darkness, followed by the distant, sickening crunch of metal. Ethan exhaled a shaky breath. For a few seconds, all he could hear was the roar of his own pulse. Then, Sophie's tiny voice. Did they die?" Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he pressed down on the accelerator and muttered, "Doesn't matter. We can't stay here." Sophie swallowed hard, nodding. Max let out a low huff, settling back onto the seat. Ethan glanced. At the road ahead, they had survived, but they weren't safe yet. Not by a long shot. The truck's engine hummed low as Ethan navigated the winding dirt road through the thick forest. The adrenaline from the chase still pulsed through his veins, but he forced himself to focus. They had gotten away. For now. The only sounds in the truck were the rhythmic thrum of the tires over gravel and Sophie's slow, uneven breathing. She hadn't said much since the chase, but Ethan could feel the weight of her fear pressing down on her small shoulders. Max, ever the guardian, sat close to her. his body relaxed, but his ears still flicking at every rustling sound outside. He hadn't let his guard down. Neither had Ethan. His fingers tightened around the wheel as he checked the GPS. Victor's cabin was still 20 miles out. He needed to call him now. Ethan pulled off onto a small clearing beside the road, shut off the engine, and pulled out his burner phone. He dialed quickly, glancing at Sophie in the rearview mirror. Her little fingers clutched at the fabric of her hoodie, but she wasn't shaking as much anymore. She was trying to be brave. Ethan pressed the phone to his ear. It rang twice before a deep, familiar voice answered. "Didn't think I'd hear from you again, Walker." Ethan exhaled sharply. "Yeah, well, I don't usually call unless I need something." Victor chuckled darkly. "And here I thought you just missed my charm." "No time for jokes," Ethan muttered, glancing out at the dark woods around them. "I need to lay low, and I need answers." Victor's tone immediately changed. "How bad?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Bad. They tore my house apart. They chased us down, and they're not stopping." Silence on the other end. Then, "You alone?" Ethan hesitated, glancing back at Sophie. "No," he admitted. Victor sighed. "Tell me you didn't go and get yourself tangled in something worse than last time." Ethan ran a hand over his face. "It's not about me. It's a kid. They're after her." Victor cursed. Ethan could hear him shifting, probably pacing his office, piecing things together like he always did. "You bring her to me?" Victor asked. "We're en route," Ethan said. "Your place still secure?" "As much as anything can be these days," Victor muttered. "You trust her?" Ethan glanced at Sophie again. She was still staring out the window, her fingers absently stroking Max's fur. She was listening. "She wasn't stupid. She's just a kid," Ethan said, voice firm. "And she's been through hell." Victor was quiet for a long time. "All right," he finally said. "Get here fast. I'll start digging." Ethan hung up. He turned to Sophie. "We're almost there. My friend Victor is going to help us." Bani Chutilam didn't respond right away. Then, "Can you trust him?" Ethan blinked. It was the first real question she'd asked since they left the house. He thought about it for a second. Victor wasn't the cleanest guy. He had a history of working in the gray areas, bending rules, breaking them when necessary. But he was loyal. And when Victor gave his word, he meant it. "Yes," Ethan said. "I can." Sophie nodded slowly, looking down at her hands. She didn't argue. That, more than anything, told Ethan she was used to not having a choice. His knuckles tightened on the steering wheel as he started the truck again. Whoever did this to her was going to pay. They reached Victor's cabin just past 4 a.m. It was tucked deep in the woods, barely visible from the road. No lights, no paved driveway, just an old wooden structure that looked like it hadn't been lived in for years, exactly the way Victor wanted it. Ethan pulled up, shut off the truck, and turned to Sophie. "We're here." She looked up at the cabin, eyes scanning the shadows, like she expected something to lunge out at them. "It's okay," Ethan assured her. "Come on." Max hopped out first, stretching before trotting toward the cabin door, nose twitching. Ethan helped Sophie down, keeping a firm hand on her shoulder as they approached the front steps. Before he could knock, the door swung open. Victor stood there, arms crossed, looking exactly the same. Same sharp eyes, same tired smirk, same barely there, stubble that made him look half civilized. "Shit," Victor said, eyeing Ethan up and down. "You look worse than I remember," Ethan huffed. "Been a long night." Victor's gaze flicked to Sophie. She shrank back slightly. Victor's smirk vanished. He stepped aside. "Get inside." Ethan guided Sophie in first, keeping a protective hand on her back. The inside of the cabin was small but packed with tech. Multiple monitors, stacks of hard drives, and wires ran across the floor like a hacker's fever dream. Victor closed the door behind them, locking 3 separate deadbolts. "You weren't followed?" he asked. Ethan shook his head. "Lost them a few miles back." Victor didn't look convinced, but he let it go. He walked toward his desk, already typing into one of his computers. "All right, let's start with the basics. Who the hell is she, and why does she have professional killers hunting her down?" Ethan hesitated. Then, turning to Sophie, he crouched in front of her. "Sweetheart," he said, voice gentle, "I need you to tell Victor what you told me about the bad men." Sophie's fingers curled into her sleeves, her shoulders hunched. Max pressed his nose against her hand, and she let out a shaky breath. Then, in a voice so small it nearly broke Ethan's heart, she whispered, "They took my mom." Victor's typing stopped. His head snapped up. His eyes locked onto Ethan's. "Shit," Victor muttered. "We need to talk. Now!" Ethan's stomach dropped. He didn't know what Victor had just realized, but judging by the look on his face, it was bad. Victor's face had gone pale. Not the kind of pale that meant shock, the kind that meant trouble. Ethan saw it immediately, recognized it. He had seen that look in cops who just realized they were about to walk into an ambush, in informants who knew they were already dead, but hadn't told you yet. Victor leaned back in his chair, rubbing his jaw. "You said they took her mom?" Sophie nodded slowly. She hadn't moved from her spot on the couch. Max pressed against her side. Victor exhaled through his nose. "Shit!" Ethan's patience snapped. "Victor, what the hell is going on?" Victor hesitated. Then he turned back to his screen, typing rapidly. The glow from the monitors illuminated the sharp lines of his face. "I ran a quick check. The second you told me about the girl," he said. "Pulled missing persons reports. Nothing. No Amber Alerts. No family statements. No record of her mother or her ever existing." Ethan frowned. "That doesn't make any damn sense." Victor's fingers tapped the keyboard again. "Exactly. And that's what set off alarms in my head." A beat. "Then, there's only one reason someone wipes every trace of a kid from public records, Ethan." Victor turned the screen toward him. "Because she was never supposed to exist." Ethan's stomach dropped. The monitor showed a classified military file, partially redacted. Every mention of names was blacked out, but one thing was clear: a list of individuals marked for containment or elimination, and Sophie's mother's name was on it. Sophie, however, was not. Ethan's pulse hammered. "Containment or elimination?" Victor nodded grimly. "This isn't just some crime syndicate after the kid. This is government level." Ethan felt ice crawl up his spine. "Her mom," Victor continued, "must have been part of something big, something classified. And then, for whatever reason, she ran." Ethan turned to Sophie. She was staring at the screen, her small hands curled into fists. She knew. Even if she didn't understand everything, she knew that her mother had been running. "Sophie," Ethan said carefully, kneeling beside her, "do you remember what your mom did? Where she worked?" Sophie's lower lip trembled. Then, in the smallest voice imaginable, she said we had to go away. That bad men were coming. Ethan swallowed hard. "And she hid me," Sophie whispered. "She said no matter what happens, I had to stay hidden." Her breath hitched. Then she screamed. Silence. Ethan felt something deep, burning, and dangerous rise inside of him. Victor exhaled. Jesus Christ! Ethan stood abruptly, pacing. So, what the hell do we do? Victor's face was tight. They've already found you once. Yeah, well, we got away. Victor shook his head. That was a warning, Ethan. Ethan froze. Victor met his eyes. They let you get away. For a moment, the cabin felt too still. Then, a sudden growl from Max. Ethan's instincts exploded into overdrive. He spun toward the front window, just in time to see the faintest movement in the tree line. Max barked, loud and sharp. Then, gunfire. Bullets shattered the window, missing Ethan's head by inches. Down! He roared, grabbing Sophie and pulling her to the floor. Victor cursed, diving for his desk. I told you they'd come, man. Ethan grabbed his gun, his mind already running 1,000 calculations. How many? Where are they? He peeked out the broken window. The woods outside were pitch black, but he saw movement. 3, maybe 4 figures closing in. Professionals. Moving fast. Suppressors on their rifles. This wasn't a kidnapping attempt. This was a kill mission. Ethan fired first. A single shot ripped through the night. One of the shadows dropped. The others scattered. Victor grabbed a shotgun from beneath his desk and racked it. Well, shit. I was starting to like this place. Another round of bullets tore into the cabin walls. Wood splintered. The monitors sparked. They were trying to flush them out. We have to move. Ethan barked. Sophie clung to Max, eyes wide, breathing fast, but she didn't scream. Ethan grabbed her, tucking her close. Victor, back door? Victor gestured. Leads to the truck. But they're expecting that. Ethan's mind worked fast. We need a distraction. Victor smirked. I got one. He reached under the desk, grabbed a small grenade, and pulled the pin. Ethan's eyes widened. Where the hell did you get that? Victor tossed it toward the front window. Some questions don't need answers. The explosion rocked the cabin. Smoke and fire engulfed the front yard. Ethan didn't wait. He yanked open the back door, pulling Sophie with him, Max following close. Gunfire erupted from the side. One of the operatives had flanked them. Victor took him down with a single. Shotgun blast! Truck! Ethan ordered. Victor sprinted to the driver's side, Ethan and Sophie diving into the back. The truck roared to life just as another burst of bullets ripped through the trees. Victor slammed on the gas. The tires screeched against the dirt. They barreled through the forest, branches slamming against the windshield. Ethan twisted in his seat, firing out the back window. He clipped one of the remaining gunmen, but the others were already moving. Then he saw it. A black SUV hidden in the trees, its headlights off. They had been watching the whole time, waiting. Ethan's gut twisted. They were playing chess, not checkers. Victor cursed. Where the hell are we going? Ethan didn't hesitate. We split up. Victor's eyes snapped to him. Ethan grabbed Sophie's hand. We take the next turn, drop us off, and you keep going. Victor's jaw tightened. You sure? We need to vanish, Ethan said. Completely. Victor exhaled sharply. Fine, but you owe me another cabin. The truck skidded onto a side path. Victor hit the brakes. Ethan pushed the door open. Sophie, come on. She scrambled out, Max right behind her. Ethan looked at Victor. Stay alive. Victor smirked. You too. Then he floored it. So, truck roared away, kicking up dust. Ethan grabbed Sophie's hand and ran into the woods. No roads, no trails, just darkness and silence. They had disappeared, for now. But Ethan knew the truth. The hunters weren't done yet. and they were just getting started. The night stretched around them like a never-ending void. Ethan moved quickly, leading Sophie through the dense forest, his grip firm but not forceful on her small hand. Every step was calculated, every sound analyzed. His breath came slow and steady, but inside, his mind was screaming. They had lost their pursuers, for now, but that meant nothing. The hunt wasn't over. Max padded alongside them, his ears flicking at every distant sound, his nose sniffing the air. He knew they were still in danger. Ethan stopped at a small clearing, his chest rising and falling, in controlled breaths. He turned to Sophie, crouching down so they were at eye level. "You okay?" She nodded, but she wouldn't look at him. She was exhausted. Her face was smudged with dirt, her hands trembling slightly from the cold. But she didn't complain. She never did. That broke Ethan more than anything. She was used to this, to running, to hiding, to being afraid. And Ethan hated that more than he could put into words. His jaw clenched. This wasn't a life for a child. They couldn't keep running forever. He knew it. She knew it. But there were no other options. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Sophie, I need to ask you something." She blinked up at him, waiting. "If we run, if we disappear for good, would you be okay with that?" Sophie hesitated, her fingers curled into the fabric of her hoodie, her breathing slow and deliberate. Then, in a whisper so small it barely reached him, "I don't want to be alone." Ethan's chest tightened. He swallowed hard, forcing down the lump in his throat. "You won't be." She looked up at him, her eyes wide and searching. "Even if we run forever?" Ethan's stomach twisted. Was that what this would be? Running forever? Never stopping, never feeling safe, always waiting for the next bullet, the next shadow moving in the dark? He had spent years of his life running from things, from mistakes, from people he'd pissed off. But this was different. This was a child, and she deserved better. "I'll keep you safe," he promised. She studied him for a long time, then whispered, "My mom said that too." Ethan's breath caught. Sophie wasn't challenging him. She wasn't angry. She was just tired. Tired of being told she was safe. Tired of losing everyone who tried to protect her. Ethan looked away, his jaw tightening. He had never wanted kids, never planned on them. Yet here he was, looking at this small, broken girl and realizing he had already made the decision before he even asked the question. He wasn't leaving her, no matter what, but running forever, that wasn't a life. It was a slow death. Max let out a soft whimper, pressing against Sophie's side, sensing her unease. She buried her fingers in his fur, grounding herself. Ethan took a deep breath. "Maybe," he hesitated, then shook his head. "Maybe we don't have to run," Sophie frowned. "But the bad men—" "I know," Ethan interrupted. "They won't stop. But maybe it's time we stop running and figure out how to end this." Sophie's lips parted slightly, her gaze flickering between him and the dark trees surrounding them. He could see the war happening inside her, the fear, the exhaustion, the hope. "You mean, fight them?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Ethan exhaled. "Maybe, but we need a plan, and we can't do it alone." He thought of Victor, of the people he knew, the few connections he had left in this world. They would never be able to run far enough. But maybe, just maybe, they could turn the game around. Sophie swallowed hard, her fingers tightening in Max's fur. "But what if we lose?" Ethan met her eyes, and for the first time in a long time, He didn't lie. Then we go down swinging. Sophie didn't answer, but she didn't argue either. And in that silence, Ethan knew. They weren't running anymore. The sun was rising. A slow golden light spilled over the horizon, filtering through the trees and casting long shadows across the damp forest floor. Birds stirred in the branches above, their calls breaking the silence that had stretched between Ethan and Sophie for the past few hours. They had made it through the night. For the first time in what felt like forever, there were no gunshots, no headlights chasing them down, no monsters in the dark. For now, Ethan sat on the edge of a small clearing, his back against a fallen log, watching as Sophie fed Max the last bit of food they had left. The dog gobbled it up gratefully, licking her fingers afterward. She smiled. It was small, barely there, but it was real. Ethan exhaled slowly. That had to count for something. They weren't safe yet. Not completely, but they weren't running anymore. They had spent the last 24 hours doing what no one expected them to do. Instead of vanishing, instead of hiding in the shadows, they had gone on the offensive. And it had worked. Victor had pulled through, finding them an escape, creating a new trail of misdirection, and burying their digital footprints so deep that even government operatives would struggle to track them. The people who had been after Sophie? They weren't all gone, but they were crippled. Ethan and Victor had made sure of that. The fight wasn't over, not completely. But for the first time since Ethan had found Sophie inside that wall, they had a chance. A chance to stop looking over their shoulders. A chance to start over. Sophie shifted beside him, pulling her knees to her chest. She was still, watching Max, running her fingers absent-mindedly through his fur. Ethan studied her for a moment before speaking. "You ever been to Montana?" Sophie blinked, turning to look at him. "No." Ethan smirked slightly. "Good. Because that's where we're headed," she frowned. "Why?" "Because it's quiet," Ethan said simply. "No one asks questions. We can disappear there. For real this time." Sophie stared at him as if trying to figure out if he was serious. Then, after a long pause, she whispered, "Can we stop? Running?" Ethan's chest tightened. He knew what she was really asking. Not just about Montana. Not just about disappearing. Can we stop being afraid? He wanted to promise her yes. Wanted to tell her that the nightmares were over. That the men who had chased them were never coming back. But he wouldn't lie to her. Not now. Instead, he reached out, ruffling her messy blonde hair. "We'll do our best, kid." She exhaled a shaky breath and nodded. That was enough. Sophie reached down, gripping Max's collar. "Will Max be okay there?" Ethan smirked. "Max'll love it. Wide open fields, no walls to scratch at." Sophie gave a small laugh. It wasn't loud. It wasn't carefree, but it was something. Ethan pushed himself up, brushing the dirt off his jeans. "Come on, let's move. Victor's got us a ride waiting." Sophie stood too, stretching her arms before taking a deep breath. Then she reached for Ethan's hand. Not because she was scared, but because she trusted him. Ethan hesitated for a second. Then, without a word, he took her hand and led her forward. Max trotted beside them as they disappeared into the trees. A new road, a new life, and for the first time in a long, long time, it felt like they had a future. Life often puts us in impossible situations, moments where running feels like the only option. But this story teaches us something powerful. At some point, we have to stop running and face the things that haunt us. Whether it's a difficult past, a toxic situation, or a fear that keeps us trapped, we all have our own battles. Ethan could have kept running forever, but he chose to stand and fight. For Sophie, for himself, for a future that wasn't built on fear. So, ask yourself, what are you running from? And more importantly, what would it take for you to stop and fight for what truly matters? Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to act despite it. Just like Ethan, we don't always know the outcome, but sometimes the only way forward is to take a stand. This story may be over, but the questions remain. What would you have done if you were in Ethan's shoes? Would you have kept running, or would you have fought back? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button. Share it with someone who loves a good thriller, and subscribe so you don't miss tomorrow's episode, because trust me, it's going to be even more intense. Until next time, stay safe, stay strong, and remember, sometimes the only way to stop running is to fight.